First, I'd like to introduce our guest for today, the one and only Carmen De La Rosa, our proud assembly member for Washington Heights and Inwood. Carmen, thank you so much for being here at Uptown Palante. We're so happy to have you.
Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to see you, and I'm so excited to be part of Uptown Palante.
So first, I know that you're Zooming today from Albany because it is a busy time right now that has been inspired by the Black Lives Matter movement. Can you tell us a little bit about what 50A is and why it needs to be repealed?
50A is a section of the civil rights law that basically grants for police officers the ability to keep their records in secret. And so what ends up happening is that if a police officer has been charged with misconduct, has had an allegation made towards them of brutality, that information is not available to the public. Here in New York, if an officer, like for example, we saw in the death of Eric Garner, if an officer kills someone, murders someone, we would have to request the information of his background and be subject to the police handing that information over to the public. What we're basically saying with the repeal of 50A is that if you are a police officer tasked with protecting and serving our community, you should not have a history of brutalizing communities of color. And if that is the case, we need to know that up front so that we know what we're dealing with, right? And be able to call it out as we see it happening. And so I think that today we're going to see a historic moment, a moment that is called upon us by the people to come to Albany and legislate, because people are just fed up and tired of seeing the blatant murder of Black lives, Black and brown lives on national television by law enforcement, by the violence that is inflicted on communities of color. And, you know, a lot of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle will say, well, there are some bad apples. There's always bad apples in every industry. But when you take an oath to protect and serve, there is no room for bad apples. And there's also no room for excuses when you're taking the life of an African-American man on the streets of America as though you are above the law. Yeah. And I think that that's something that we're seeking to fix today.
You have always been outspoken about issues of injustice, and especially now during this time, we've seen pictures of you online. You have been speaking out in protest. You have attended rallies. You have helped to organize vigils uptown for Black lives. What does this movement mean for you? Why is it important? Why is it important for you to be part of this movement, both as an elected official, as a woman of color, as a Dominican, as a mother?
People have taken to the streets because the streets belong to the people, period. And when people are angry, they must protest in order to create change. We've seen this in the civil rights movement, when people were fighting for equality for Black Americans in this country. We saw it when the uprisings happened and the LGBTQ community had the Stonewall rebellions. When the student movement, right, has been calling for dignified and affordable and free education in this country. We've seen how protests have led people like me, legislators, towards change. And so if it takes people to take the streets in order for people to realize that the encounters that we're having with law enforcement on the street are not normal, that we can normalize them, then that is what is going to take in order to create the change that we're seeing today in legislatures across the country, in the New York State legislature, in Congress, in the halls of Congress, and also in city councils across cities in this nation. And so I think it's so important. For me, it's personal. You know, I am a woman of Dominican descent, and just being of Dominican descent means that I have African blood in my body, in my soul, in my heart. That struggle of the Black people is the struggle of the Dominican people. It is the struggle of the oppressed. I am married to a man who is Dominican and Haitian, and we are raising, as you said, a very beautiful Black child at home. And I really do feel that the legacy of America that we leave for our children can't continue to be a legacy of death, can't continue to be a legacy of racism. And we got to call it out for what it is, because if not, there won't be change, and our children will be dealing with this in the next 20 years, right? In the next 40 years. I'm a member also of the Corrections Committee. I asked to be put on that committee because representing a community like Washington Heights, I know that so many of my peers have been impacted by the criminal justice system. We've lost so many generations of men and women in Uptown to this system that mass incarcerates Black and brown bodies simply for being Black and brown. One of the chants that we heard this weekend on the march that we had in our community was being Black is not a crime. And for me, that resonated so heavily because it's true, being Black, being poor, that's not a crime. And so why are we criminalizing Black people in America still? And that's the question that we have to answer for ourselves.
One of the actions and demands that has come out of the Black Lives Matter movement is to defund the police. And I've seen signs of you've been vocal about it, and not many elected officials have. Can you tell us what that means to you and why we should defund the police?
First of all, if we look at a city budget and a state budget, right? We are running right now in a deficit. And we know that the police budget in the city is proposed to remain intact while we're cutting programs like SYP, while we're cutting the arts, while we're cutting enrichment programs for our children, while we know that our children right now are not even receiving the education that they deserve because of remote learning and the disparities that have existed there. And so for me, it's like, how can it fit in anyone's mind that we're going to continue to use a militarized presence of police in our communities to police us against our will and not provide opportunities for our children? And so for me, when I say defund the police, what I mean is create equity in a budget that right now is not providing opportunity for future generations. If we want our children to be out of the streets and we don't want them to become statistics, then we must provide an opportunity for them to actually have a future. And that is through programs like SYP.
Finally, I'd love to end by asking you, in the midst of all of the sadness and trauma and anger and actions that are coming during this time, what gives you hope? What gives you the joy to keep on going in moments when it's difficult?
Something that brings me joy is seeing our community rise up to this moment, rise up to this occasion. You know, people thought that there were going to be protests for one day or two, and it's going on 2 weeks now. And we got to continue to take these streets. We got to continue to mobilize. I'm seeing so many messages on my Instagram and my Facebook from young people that are actually looking and watching. And it fills me with joy that people are proactively saying we have to get involved. And I think that when we have conversations, like when I talk to my daughter and I see how intelligent, how humane, how compassionate she is, it fills me with joy understanding that the future of our community lies in their hand, because they are far much more prepared than we have ever been to actually show this world what it's like to be humane, to have compassion, to be kind, to understand their differences. Their language is a universal language that did not exist when I was growing up. And for me, that brings me joy and that brings me hope that we're in good hands.
Mm-hmm. Carmen, thank you. Thank you for your leadership and your voice. We so love you and always are so proud that you are our elected official. And we know we can always count on you to fight for what's wrong and call it out. Fight for what's right. We can always count on you to fight for what's right and call out what's wrong. Gracias por ser nuestra vecina, nuestra amiga y nuestra líder.
Gracias, Mino and Bob and everybody at PTP. You all have such a beautiful mission of empowering through the arts. And I feel blessed to just be in your presence and understand that you understand this struggle. And so, hasta la próxima. Thank you so much.
And thank you for repealing 58.
We're on the way. Thank you.
Ay, gracias.